Hello, good evening. At a time marked by shifting geopolitical landscapes, the United States, under President Trump, has adopted a foreign policy that prioritizes national interest while risking international isolation. This approach, characterized by unilateral actions and a departure from traditional alliances, raises critical questions about its long-term implications. As tensions continue to escalate in regions like the Middle East and trust erodes in international agreements, the global community watches closely. Will this America First strategy ultimately strengthen US influence, or will it push nations to seek alternative partnerships and challenge America's role on the world stage? Welcome to Think Tank.
Donald Trump is his name. He's there to stay.
As unlikely, impossible is now reality.
We will make America powerful. We will win, win, win. Will make America great again. Let's do what I already carry. We will very quickly make America great again.
Now, Donald Trump's recent actions seek to reassert American dominance on the global stage, often at the expense of international collaboration. Trump's withdrawal from the UN climate negotiations and agreements and the World Health Organization, along with threats to avoid G20 meetings, signals a rejection of multilateralism. His policies, such as halting US aid programs and imposing tariffs, challenge allies and weaken global solidarity. A response, perhaps, is necessary, maybe grounded in historical lessons. Tactical coalitions involving both the global north and south could be essential to counter Trump's influence. And the international community may well push back against harmful US policies and perhaps promote sustainable global governance. As Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, exercises increasing influence over the US government, the dangers of private interests controlling political power become more evident. Time magazine stated that Musk's massive financial contributions to President Trump's campaign, alongside the collapse of legal safeguards on campaign financing, have allowed tech billionaires like Musk to exert unprecedented control. Legal precedents like Citizens United have led to an environment where billionaires can direct political campaigns and influence government operations. This concentration of wealth and power, combined with weakened checks on presidential authority, pose a significant threat to democracy. While legal and political resistance is emerging, real reform could be needed to curb corruption, restore checks and balances, and address the growing power of tech oligarchs.
The narrative of U.S. foreign policy under President Trump's second term unfolds against the backdrop of escalating regional tensions, particularly in the Middle East. His unwavering support for Israel, particularly in its war with the Palestinians, raises concerns about escalating instability. Trump's remarks about taking control of Gaza and relocating its Palestinian population reflect a unilateral approach that dismisses diplomatic norms, heightening tensions and obstructing peace efforts. This unilateral stance extends to Trump's broader strategy, weakening international institutions like NATO and the United Nations. By prioritizing American interests over collective security, Trump risks diminishing Washington's global leadership role, encouraging allies to seek alternative partnerships. The withdrawal from agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal further erodes international trust, pushing nations toward independent alliances that may counter U.S. influence. Additionally, Trump's contentious proposal to acquire territories such as Greenland and the Panama Canal underscore an expansionist mindset, fueling global apprehension. Domestically, Trump's strict immigration policies and border security measures may strain relations with neighboring countries, which perceive them as hostile acts. His protectionist trade policies and tariffs could provoke retaliatory measures, leading to trade blocs that challenge U.S. economic dominance. Trump's America First doctrine, with its focus on narrow U.S. interests, risks alienating allies who seek partners committed to shared global responsibilities. This shift could redefine international relations, prompting countries to navigate a world where U.S. engagement is increasingly transactional. The implications of these policies will shape global diplomacy for years to come.
Now, joining us to give more analysis on the situation and this America First policy from the President of the United States is a member of the Republican Party, Ginger Chapman, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks for being there with us. Let's start with the Middle East, shall we? What do you think the principles are behind Trump's approach to foreign policy in the Middle East? And let's, of course, start by mentioning his idea to take over the Gaza Strip and America to own it.
Yes, well, thank you for having me today. And that is an excellent question. All eyes are in the Middle East right now. The entire world was shocked and surprised by Trump's insistence that the United States was going to take over Gaza, develop Gaza, turn it into a Riviera, and prevent the original Palestinians from returning. Many people are surprised and are trying to determine what is behind this. The most obvious explanation is the influence of the Jewish lobby in the United States. The other explanation is that perhaps in some way Trump is trying to contain the situation, keep the ceasefire going, and discourage the Netanyahu cabinet from continuing to bomb Gaza. Now, this is very risky. No one knows where this is going. And this is further complicated by other factors such as the enormous gas deposits offshore, which people are now turning their eyes to. So on one hand, this could be Trump approaching this like his businessman, make a deal. What is in this for the United States? We can have peace on the basis of economic trade, and economic security will bring about peace. On the other hand, Trump's proposal is impractical. This will never happen under the current conditions, especially in light of relations with neighboring countries. So this is a very unprecedented situation for the world to be in.
When you saw that press conference with Netanyahu standing by Trump's side, as someone who's a committed and strong and respected Republican like yourself, how did that make you feel? Did you think he'd gone off the rails a little bit?
This was completely unexpected, and one thing we have seen is this is dividing the Republican Party. Many Trump supporters and voters felt betrayed because this is viewed as Trump breaking his campaign promise of putting America first, and he is immediately becoming entangled in this endless foreign war. There are also other Republicans who are very pleased because they are sort of viewed as Christian Zionists, and they believe that this is part of the greater Israeli project that the United States can support. So Trump's statements with respect to Gaza have divided the Republican Party. This is a very deep divide between the supporters that want to end foreign involvement, want to end foreign aid. These are the Republicans like Senator Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, and even Lindsey Graham, a notorious warmonger, has come out and said this is a very terrible idea. This is doomed to fail. And once again, the side of the Republican Party that wants to get involved, the Christian Zionist wing, this is setting up a conflict between the Republican Party. Many people feel betrayed, and this is going to play out in Congress and on the streets of America if this continues.
And that's unusual, isn't it? Because up until now, people have been in the Republican Party, for the most part, those who haven't been expelled, have been fully behind Trump. And he does seem to have taken a little bit of a different tactic when it comes to Gaza, doesn't he? Since he took office. But let me ask you about global solidarity and the challenges that brings. How can global solidarity be maintained in the face of these economic and political difficulties with Trump in the White House and also with the rise of China and India?
Well, unfortunately, if global solidarity means the world uniting against America, then Trump may have set us down a dangerous path. Trump campaigned on economic security at home, peace and prosperity. And what we are seeing is Trump's recent belligerence, wanting to take over Greenland. This is not the way towards global solidarity. However, one thing we did see, and this might be a clue as to Trump's strategy, Trump said we were going to take back the Panama Canal. He sent Secretary of State Marco Rubio to Panama. However, there was no military companionship. Instead, Marco Rubio negotiated free transit for American naval ships through the Panama Canal. So it remains to be seen, is Trump making these bold statements as a strong opening negotiation tactic, which, by the way, appears to be angering the rest of the world and increasing the solidarity of the global South and the BRICS community? Or is this an opening salvo by Trump to get attention and then begin negotiations down a more reasonable path?
Well, they're the questions that we all seem to be asking at every statement by the president. But let me just bring in another guest here, Laurie Watkins, who's the former advisor to President Barack Obama, also joining us from D.C. Thank you very much for being here with us. We're just discussing Trump's America First policy. Is this damaging relations with United States traditional allies?
Greetings to your viewers, and thank you for having me on your program. This is absolutely devastating the United States reputation around the world and the trust that not just our allies, but those that may not be necessaries, they're viewing us from around the world and saying, what the heck is America doing? What the heck is Donald Trump and Elon Musk doing? Do they not see that these are going to have cataclysmic effects on a very small issue, which is waste, fraud, and abuse, but they're dismantling the entire federal government at the same time? What I'm particularly very concerned about as a foreign policy, your region of the world where your viewers are, I'm absolutely concerned about what this president is saying, is that he has language, even with the Jordanian king who came to visit the White House. You could see how uncomfortable he was when Donald Trump was saying that the plan is for all of these surrounding countries, including Egypt, by the way, that he's going to make them take these Palestinian refugees so he can clear out Gaza and then develop it and then take it. He used very clear, very strong words the other day in his press briefing when he said, "We don't have to buy it, we will take it." It is not the United States to take. And I'm sure you would all agree with that. The fact that Israel Netanyahu is having these backdoor negotiations at the same time there's supposed to be a ceasefire deal going on is absolutely concerning. But the fact that Trump is using this very strong language that he is going to force our allies like Jordan and Egypt to take these folks is just, it's reprehensible.
Indeed. Well, I'm just going to break in for a moment, because we're now going to go live to a press conference being delivered by the U.S. Secretary of Defense.
First place. But I challenge anyone else to think of a world leader at this moment who, with credibility and strength, could bring those two leaders to the table and forge a durable peace that ultimately serves the interests of Ukraine, stops the killing and the death, which Trump has been clear he wants to do, and hopefully ultimately is guaranteed by strength of Europeans who are there prepared to back it up.
Why not invoke Article 5 then for the NATO peacekeeping forces that could potentially be deployed? How does that deter President Putin?
Well, I would say, I want to be clear about something as it pertains to NATO membership not being realistic outcome for negotiations. That's something that was stated as part of my remarks here, as part of a coordination with how we're executing these ongoing negotiations, which are led by President Trump. All of that said, these negotiations are led by President Trump. Everything is on the table in his conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. What he decides to allow or not allow is at the purview of the leader of the free world, of President Trump. So I'm not going to stand at this podium and declare what President Trump will do or won't do, what will be in or what will be out, what concessions will be made or what concessions are not made. I can look, as our team has, at what's realistic, likely on an outcome. I think realism is an important part of the conversation that hasn't existed enough inside conversations amongst friends. But simply pointing out realism, like the borders won't be rolled back to what everybody would like them to be in 2014, is not a concession to Vladimir Putin. It's a recognition of hard power realities on the ground after a lot of investment and sacrifice, first by the Ukrainians and then by allies, and then a realization that a negotiated peace is going to be some sort of demarcation that neither side wants. But it's not my job as the Secretary of Defense to define the parameters of the President of the United States as he leads some of the most complex and consequential negotiations in the world.
Sticking with the U.S. press, let us go with Axios' Zach Basu, right in the far right.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Given the position you've now staked out, what leverage exactly is Ukraine being left with, especially if the U.S. also plans to wind down its military aid? And then quickly, if a NATO ally is attacked by Russia or any country, will the U.S. unequivocally uphold its obligations under Article 5, regardless of that country's...
Well, we've said we're committed to the alliance, and that's part of the alliance, right? You point out Article 5, you point out Article 3. It's just a cheap, I'm not saying it's cheap coming from you, but it's just a cheap political point to say, oh, we've left all the negotiating cards off the table by recognizing some realities that exist on the ground. President Zelensky understands the realities on the ground, President Putin understands the realities on the ground, and President Trump, as a deal maker, as a negotiator, understands those dynamics as well. By no means is anything that I state here, even though we lead the most powerful military in the world, hemming in the commander-in-chief in his negotiations to ultimately decide where it goes or does not go. Well, he's got all the cards he would like. And the interesting part is, oftentimes, while the conventional status quo mindset or the legacy media wants to play checkers, the same checkers game we've been playing for decades, President Trump, time and time again, finds a way to play chess. As a deal maker, as a businessman who understands how to create realities and opportunities where they otherwise may not exist. Take, for example, the conversations that our Treasury Secretary had in Kiev recently with President Zelensky, which will continue in Munich with our Vice President and Secretary of State, around investments and resources inside Ukraine. I don't want to get ahead of any decision or announcement that could be made there. It could be any number of parameters. But President Trump, as a deal maker and a businessman, recognizes that an investment relationship with Ukraine, ultimately in the long term for the United States, is a lot more tangible than any promises or shared values we might have, even though we have them. There is something to relationships and deals in real ways, whether militarily or economically or diplomatically, that he sees that are possibilities that could forge together a lot of opportunities to show that solidarity that Vladimir Putin will clearly recognize. That's one of any number of other opportunities that this president will leverage in these high-stakes negotiations. So I just reject on its face the premise that somehow President Trump isn't dealing with a full set of cards when he's the one that can determine ultimately what cards he holds.
Great. Now shifting to the international press, we'll take the French wire service Agence France Presse with Max Delaney.
Thank you very much. Secretary of Defense, you've spoken about trying to force both Putin and Zelensky to the table. Can you give a guarantee that no deal will be forced on Ukraine that they do not want to accept, and also that you will include Europe in the negotiations about an issue that concerns European security? And can you tell us whether the US will continue to supply arms to Ukraine during any negotiations?
Well, to the first part of your question, that's not ultimately my decision. The President will lead these negotiations alongside our Secretary of State, our National Security Advisor, and numerous other officials that will be involved. And ultimately, we've played our role in talking to our NATO allies about what that would look like. President Trump, I want to point out, I've got the truths right here that he posted, called both, in case we missed it, Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky. Called them both. Any negotiation that's had will be had with both. I also am very encouraged by what the Secretary General has said here. Clearly attuned to the realities of the moment, the need for peace, and that the NATO alliance and European members will play a role in that. Ultimately, President Trump speaking to those two countries is central to the deal being made, but it affects a lot of people, of course. So I'm not going to be involved in those intimate diplomatic negotiations. That's for the pros atop the Trump administration who do diplomacy and negotiations. Ultimately, as security assistance, we have continued to provide what has been allocated. I think it would be fair to say that things like future funding, either less or more, could be on the table in negotiations as well. Whatever the president determines is the most robust carrot or stick on either side to induce a durable peace, understanding, obviously, the motivations that Vladimir Putin has had on Ukraine for quite some time. Thank you.
We'll have a second international press outlet. We'll go with the German paper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung with Dr. Thomas Kuczka.
Thanks a lot, Thomas Kuczka, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Good afternoon. Mr. Secretary, two questions, please. The first one regarding the new defense investment pledge. When you and President Trump speak about raising it to 5%, do you mean European allies only, or do you mean the US as well, which is currently at 3.4% according to NATO statistics? And if the latter is true, when do you think the US could possibly reach the goal of spending 5% on defense? That's number one. Number two, you've said yesterday that Europeans need to take ownership of their own conventional security. So should Europeans expect that ultimately the US would withdraw the bulk of their forces from Europe and just leave in place what is necessary for nuclear deterrence? I know there's a revision going on. I don't expect you to name any numbers, but maybe give us an outlook of what we should expect. Thank you.
Thank you. I think nobody can or should contest the extent of America's willingness to invest in national security. We have a budget of $850 billion spent on defense. I'm in the business of ensuring that every dollar of that is used wisely, which is why we're pushing a Pentagon audit and making sure that we're cutting fat so that we've got more at the tip of the spear. 3.4% is a very robust investment. larger than most of our allies within NATO. Any defense minister or secretary of defense that tells you they wouldn't want more would be lying to you. I understand that. Ultimately, we have our own budgetary considerations to be had, but I don't think an unwillingness of NATO allies to invest in their own defense spending can be dismissed away by trying to point at the $900 billion that America has invested around the globe to include the NATO alliance and saying that's not enough. So ultimately, we are very much committed to the NATO alliance and to our allies, but without burden sharing, without creating the right set of incentives for European countries to invest, then we would be forced to attempt to be everywhere for everybody all the time, which in a world of fiscal restraints is, again, to get back to that word reality, just not reality. So yes, we will continue to spend robustly. Our expectation of our friends, and we say this in solidarity, is you have to spend more on your defense, for your country, on that continent, understanding that the American military and the American people stand beside you as we have in NATO, but can't have the expectation of being the permanent guarantor, as I alluded to, from what even Eisenhower observed post-World War II. That shift has to happen. The peace dividend has to end. There are autocrats with ambitions around the globe, from Russia to the Communist Chinese. Either the West awakens to that reality and creates combat multipliers with their allies and partners, to include NATO, or we will abdicate that responsibility to somebody else with all the wrong values. You mentioned Europe. We have not said in any way that we're abandoning our allies in Europe. There have been no decisions based on troop levels. Again, that's a discussion to be had by the commander-in-chief in these high-stakes negotiations. And that would most likely come later on. But there is a recognition that the ambitions of the Communist Chinese are a threat to free people everywhere, to include America's interests in the Pacific. And it makes a lot of sense, just in a common sense way, to use our comparative advantages. European countries spending here in defense of this continent, in defense of allies here, against an aggressor on this continent with ambitions. That strikes me as the right place to invest. And I don't say that in a condescending way. I say that in a common sense, practical way. Investing in defense on the continent makes sense. We support that as well. It also makes sense comparatively and geographically for the United States, along with allies in the Pacific, like Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Australia and others, to also invest in allies and partners and capabilities in the Pacific to project power there in service of deterrence. That deterrent effect in the Pacific is one that really can only be led by the United States. We wish we could lead everywhere at all times. We will stand in solidarity with allies and partners and encourage everyone to invest in order to have force multiplication of what we represent, but it requires realistic conversations. Those with disingenuous motives in the media, I don't mean to look at you, just saying anyone that suggests its abandonment are trying to drive a wedge between allies that does not exist. We are committed to that NATO alliance. We understand the importance of that partnership, but it can't endure on the status quo forever in light of the threats we face and fiscal realities. Europe has to spend more, NATO has to spend more, has to invest more, and we're very encouraged by what the Secretary General has said. And frankly, behind closed doors, what a lot of our allies have said as well, acknowledging that reality. And that's why when I say make NATO great again, it's what President Trump set out to do in 2017. The press said President Trump is abandoning NATO. He's turning his back on our NATO allies. That's what the headlines read in 2017 and 2018. What actually happened? That tough conversation created even more investment to the point where now almost every NATO country is meeting the 2% goal that was said to be egregious when he first said it. Now European countries are abandonment otherwise continue to be disingenuous. And we are proud to be part of this alliance and stand by it. I'll take a couple more. Sure.
Why don't we take one from a U.S. outlet and one from an international outlet? With the U.S. outlet, pardon me, sir, what we're going to take from the U.S. is Logan Rattick from Newsmax, please.
Mr. Secretary, you talked about expanding the defense industrial base and also expediting foreign military sales. Can you expand on that a little bit and how important that is to NATO?
Well, one of the self-evident conclusions of the war in Ukraine was the underinvestment that both the European continent and America has had, unfortunately, in the defense industrial base. The ability to produce munitions, emerging technologies, rapidly and field them, was a blind spot exposed through the aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine has responded to that, as we've had a chance to listen to a great deal. Europe is responding to that, and so is America. We have to do more to ensure, whether you call it the arsenal for democracy or defending the free world, if America can't build and export and build and provide rapid capabilities because we're too stale or static or bureaucratic or the Pentagon is bloated, then we're not able to field the systems we need in the future. So deep and dramatic reforms are coming at the Defense Department with the leadership of President Trump to ensure that we're investing robustly in our defense industrial base. A great example is shipbuilding. We need to vastly increase our ability to build ships and submarines, not just for ourselves, but to honor obligations to our allies as well. And we will do that. Foreign military sales is another thing I mentioned this morning with the Secretary General. We have, for a long time, been the country, by, with, and through, that our allies are able to supply major platforms and weapon systems like the F-35 and the Patriots and others. Whatever the system is, we need to reform that process so it's quicker. So a request today isn't delivered 7 years from now, but 3 years from now with less red tape and with the most efficient and effective technology possible. We hear that from our allies, and that's part of being a good faith partner, is we're going to invest in our defense industrial base. We're going to make sure foreign military sales are as rapid as possible, which again is a force multiplier for American power, which is something we want to do in a contested world.
For our final question, we'll go to an international outlet, the Japanese service NHK with Tsuchiya.
That's Peter Hegseth there, the United States Secretary of Defense, a colourful character who was a Fox News host before he became Secretary of Defense. He was talking there about NATO and NATO's defense spending, NATO countries' defense spending, mentioning that Trump wanted other NATO allies to up the spending to 5%. And it was then pointed out that the United States itself only spends 3.4%. When it came to Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations, he was asked, will a deal be forced on Ukraine? And Hegseth said that it's not for him to decide. And he also said that borders not going back, Ukraine borders not going back to 2014 borders is not a win for Vladimir Putin. That's the words of Peter Hegseth, who is the US Secretary of Defense speaking in Brussels. And I'd like to thank the guests who joined me on the program today. Laurie Watkins, a former advisor to President Barack Obama, and Ginger Chapman, a senior member of the Republican Party. Thank you very much for watching us here on Think Tank. Stay tuned on Q News for more. Good night.